I have CDs and DVDs that were made from my television program, and we also have a series on David, Lessons from David, and a series on Elijah, Lessons from Elijah. And we're offering all three of these as a package deal. We also have a summary that is just a brief summary of this teaching on Joseph, and my staff put this together. It's from my teaching, but they took it and put it together, and it's just a brief summary. This is a free gift to you. If you would like to receive that, you can get that. The other things, we're asking for a donation of any amount for those individual teachings. So we're now talking about Joseph. This is the beginning of my second week, and I've already said a lot of things. I'm in Genesis chapter 39. This is after Joseph has already been sold into slavery. And God was with him, and he was a prosperous man, even as a slave. And the favor of God was on him so much that his master Potiphar put everything that he had under his hands and didn't even pay any attention to anything because Joseph was so trustworthy. And in that situation, Potiphar's wife, she started trying to seduce Joseph, and Joseph refused to give in to it, which said a lot about him. Most people would be so depressed, so discouraged to come from the rich kid, the favorite son of his father, to being sold into slavery, that they would be so bitter, so angry, so hurt and depressed that they would just give in and think, well, I owe it to myself. Look how I've been treated. But no, Joseph maintained his integrity. He was still holding on to those visions that God had given him through those two dreams, and he was headed someplace. He wasn't going to stay a slave forever, and because of it, he was unwilling to compromise his integrity. And I spent a lot of time talking about how that Joseph said, how could I do this great wickedness and sin against God? It would have been a sin against Potiphar, true, and he mentioned that, but the main thing was it was a sin against God. And this is one of the things that the Lord spoke to me when I was in Vietnam that really ministered to me about. It didn't matter whether people back in the States knew what I did. I could have gotten by with doing all kinds of things, but I couldn't get by with sinning against God. It was my personal relationship with the Lord that kept me from entering into the things that other people did. And this is missing in so many people's lives. They have situational ethics, and it's all dependent on what the majority is doing. And it goes by the standards of other people. They don't care what the Bible says. They don't let the Bible get in the way of what they believe. It's all about what they can get by with, what is accepted. Man, you need to go beyond that. You need to have a personal relationship. And because of my personal relationship with the Lord, I could not enter into the things that other people who were even friends of mine in Vietnam did, because I had a relationship with God. And it wasn't about whether I got caught or not. It wasn't about whether anybody knew what happened. I knew that God knew, and I had a relationship with Him, and that's what kept me going straight. And so Joseph refused to have sex with the master's wife, and she lusted after him, and finally one day she cornered him and thought that she was going to coerce him into having sexual relationships with her, and he fled. And she grabbed his coat, and he just let her have it, and he ran off, and she kept the coat. And her love that she supposedly had for Joseph turned into hatred, and she lied about him, called the other servants and said, see, this man came in to rape me, and I screamed, and he left his garment. And it was a total lie. Here's one of the points that I want to make, is that we have been so sexualized today, and in our movies, man, it's everywhere. And people are saying, oh, I just love this person so much. But it is not God's kind of love. It's just carnal. It's sensual. It's devilish. And right here, you can tell that the love, quote unquote, that Potiphar's wife had for Joseph, it wasn't God's kind of love. It was all selfish. And when she was rebuffed by Joseph and he would not consent to having sexual relationships, then she turned around and lied about him and had him committed unto prison. What kind of love is that? That's not love. And sad to say, the world today doesn't have a clue what God's kind of love is. It's all this emotional thing, and it's all selfish. And the moment self isn't satisfied, then it turns into hatred, just like she did. She was willing to lie about him and put him in prison. And as far as she's concerned, he could have rotted in prison the rest of his days. That's not love. I tell you what, so many people are being attracted to today is not God's kind of love. You can read over in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 4 through 8, and it lists God's kind of love. And it is vastly different than what the world is calling love today. What the world is calling love is lust, and one of the ways you can tell between God's kind of love and lust is selfishness. If it is God's kind of love, it will be unselfish. You will think about the other person more than about yourself. If it is lust, it's always about you. It's always self-gratification. And that's exactly what happened with Potiphar's wife. It was all about her. It was all her lust. It goes on to say that in the NIV, it says that Joseph was well built and handsome. He was a very attractive man, and it was all about her, satisfying her lust. And the moment she didn't get her way, she turned on him. And notice also, it says in verse 16, she laid up his garment by her until his Lord came home, and she spake unto him according to these words, saying, the Hebrew servant which thou hast brought unto us came in unto me to mock me. She was accusing him of trying to rape her. And it came to pass, as I lifted up my voice and cried, that he left his garment with me and fled out. And it came to pass, when his master heard the words of his wife, which she spake unto him, saying, after this manner did thy servant unto me, that his wrath was kindled, and Joseph's master took him and put him into the prison, a place where the king's prisoners were bound, and he was there in the prison. Again, one of the things to get from this is what didn't happen. Joseph never tried to justify himself. You know, if this would have been most of us, I guarantee you most of us would have gotten the other servants, and I can guarantee you this master's wife, she sounded like she was quite the piece of work. And I guarantee you most people would have understood that Joseph's integrity would not have let him do this, and they probably understood that she was a very loose woman, and he could have gotten servants to testify to his integrity, to verify things he was saying, but he didn't say any of those things. He didn't try and justify himself. Now, you know, it's possible that as a servant he didn't have the right, that his master may not have even asked him, but most of us, if we had been in a situation where we were accused unjustly, I guarantee you, whether it was proper or not, we would have been shouting out our own innocency. We would be promoting ourselves. And Joseph just entrusted himself to the Lord. Jesus said this in John chapter 5, verse 44. He says, how can you believe which receive honor one of another and seek not the honor that comes from God alone? Most of us are so dependent upon being approved by people that we would sell our soul to the devil if it meant that we were accepted by other people. A person who's in truly relationship with God will stand before God, and it's our relationship with God that counts, and we don't have to always justify ourselves. God will justify us. You know, I could spend 2 or 3 days programs giving you examples of this in my life. I'm not going to go into all of that detail, but I honestly was run out of town one time because I was falsely accused of doing some things, and it was not my fault at all. I missed a funeral that everybody was expecting me to go to. This young man told everybody, anyway, I should have been there, but I was actually kidnapped. And that's the reason I didn't show up. And because I didn't show up, I literally had 5 Bible studies that I was conducting just reject me and say, we don't welcome you anymore. They didn't understand. And yet what was I going to do? Sit there and criticize and reveal the people who kidnapped me and disgrace them when they're sitting there grieving over one of their relatives that had died? Rather than sit there and justify myself, I just let it go. And I had a lot of people reject me. And I guarantee it was hard on me and Jamie, but we were more concerned about our relationship with God and integrity, and instead of just trying to justify ourselves. And I won't take time to give you the whole testimony, but 5 years later, God revealed what had happened and did it in a way that it justified us and proved to people what had happened without me having to do it at all. I had another situation where a very famous minister, that if I was to mention their name, you would know who I'm talking about. They got up in front of their church and told them I'm the slickest cult since Jim Jones told their people to burn my materials, books and CDs and things like this. And rather than retaliate, I just didn't say a thing because I didn't want people to turn against this ministry. I didn't know why they got so upset with me, but I didn't sit there and justify myself. And did you know it was 20 years later, but I was on television on a TBN broadcast, and we were both being interviewed on there. And this person just told me how much they love me, and they watch my program every day, and they've invited me over to their house. I have their personal phone number, and I don't know what happened. They're getting older. It's possible that they're senile and forgot what they did. I don't know what happened, but you know what? God put us back together. And when they had a special birthday, they actually asked me if I would give some kind of an endorsement. The person who at one time was branded as the slickest cult by them. And God defended me. And this is what you see here in Joseph. I got this from Joseph. Joseph didn't defend himself. He trusted God to make it right. You know, the scripture says in Romans chapter 12, and that's a quotation from an Old Testament passage, but it says, "Vengeance is mine, saith the Lord. I will repay." Did you know you can get to a place to where you let God defend you instead of you defending yourself? And I can say it this way. If you do defend yourself, and if you just get up and promote yourself, and you've always got to come out right, and you've always got to correct every wrong, if you have that attitude, God won't defend you. You can either let God defend you or you can defend yourself. And I can guarantee you, God will defend you better than you would defend yourself. Now, sometimes you need to stand up and fight against evil because it's truth against lies. But I'm saying that when it comes down to just you have to defend yourself and promote yourself, that's not a godly attitude. That's not the attitude that Joseph had. Joseph didn't speak a thing. He didn't try and justify himself. He knew the truth. He knew that the master's wife knew the truth. And even though he was being accused unjustly, he suffered the consequences. And he did not lose his faith in the two visions that God had given him about him being exalted and his brethren eventually coming and bowing down to him. And so it says in the next verse, this is Genesis chapter 39, verse 21, "But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy." So here again, it says that when Joseph was sold into slavery, Genesis 39:2 says, "But the Lord was with Joseph and he was a prosperous man." When nothing looked like he was prosperous and nothing looked like God was with him, the scripture says God was with him, and Joseph believed that, and because of it, he was promoted and became the head over the master's house. Then when the master's wife lied about him and he got put into prison, most people would think, man, that's even worse than being a slave. Now he's condemned to prison. And I can guarantee you his prison wasn't like our prisons today, where they have flat screen TVs and all of these freedoms and liberties and things like that. I guarantee you this was a bad situation. And yet it says, "But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy." Here again, he is a prosperous man, even in prison. Man, that's awesome. Again, one of the lessons to learn from Joseph is that it doesn't matter what things look like on the outside. You have to go by what God has revealed to you in your heart. And everything that's in the natural is subject to change. Over in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, the Apostle Paul said, "Our light affliction, which is but for a moment, works for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory, while we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal," that means temporary, subject to change, "but the things that are not seen are eternal." Most people look at their life and they evaluate things based totally on what things look like in the natural, what the doctor says, what your bank account says. But did you know you can get to where you live your life by what God says? My wife and I went through extreme poverty because of my own stupidity. It wasn't God's fault. It was my own fault. But we went through extreme poverty for 10 years. But did you know we never were poor in our hearts? Even though there was times that Jamie, when we were 8 months pregnant, Jamie went 2 weeks with nothing but water. That's terrible, and that's bad on me. It was my fault because I was called to the ministry, and I thought if I was called to the ministry, I was sinning against God. if I went and got a job. That was wrong, but that's the way I thought. My heart was right, but my head was wrong. It was my fault. But did you know, even though we went through that poverty, we never talked poor. We never thought poor. We never saw that this is the way our whole life was going to be. I still believed that God was for me and that I was going to prosper. And I guarantee you, I never planned on staying in that situation. It doesn't matter what your circumstances are like. It matters what you see in your heart. And I saw myself prospering. Even though I wasn't prospering on the outside, I was prospering on the inside. There's been times that I've seen myself well when my body looked sick. And yet I have that vision. Did you know it says, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. Proverbs 23:7. If you can see yourself prosperous, regardless of what the world says or circumstances say, you will eventually be prosperous. If you can see yourself healed, you will eventually be healed. If you can see it on the inside, as you think in your heart, that's the way your life is going to be. Man, those are strong statements. But I get that from Joseph's life. The Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, even though in the natural, nobody would say that the Lord was with Joseph. Man, since God gave Joseph those 2 dreams, everything that had happened in his life was bad. His brothers rejected him. They tried to kill him. They eventually sold him into slavery. And then even as a slave, his master's wife lied about him. And here he was now shut up in prison. Every step that he had taken had been down. It wasn't up. And yet these visions showed that someday he was going to be exalted and his brothers would actually come and bow down to him. And yet in the natural, it just went down and down and down. I'll make a bigger point of this when we get over to the 41st chapter. But did you know that it was 13 years after those dreams before he was promoted. Then it was another 7 years through the years of prosperity, and another 2 years through the years of drought. So a total of 22 years from the time that God gave him those dreams until he saw them come to pass. And it was 13 years from the time he had those dreams until the first positive thing happened. For 13 years, every step that he took was down. You know, some people might be able to last through a few little things. But if for 13 years, every time you turned around, things were getting worse instead of better, most people had quit. And yet Joseph maintained his integrity. Joseph maintained his vision. And as we talk about what he did in prison, it'll show you that he wasn't there complaining. He wasn't bitter. He wasn't angry. He wasn't depressed. He wasn't giving up. He was still functioning, hitting on all cylinders, trusting God and believing that those visions were coming to pass. So it says in this 21st verse, but the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy and gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners that were in the prison, and whatsoever they did there, he was the doer of it. The keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. This is the exact same thing that happened with Joseph when he was sold into slavery. Potiphar saw that the Lord was with him and that everything he did prospered. That doesn't happen to people who are bitter and angry and operating in unforgiveness and have just given up and are depressed. No, Joseph was still believing God. He was still a man of integrity, even though everything in his life looked like it was going wrong. And the keeper of the prison saw it. And because of it, he committed everything he had to Joseph. He didn't even know what was going on in the prison. You know, it doesn't say this specifically about the Egyptians, but when the Romans came along during the time of the New Testament, you can see this in the 16th chapter of Acts, and there's other places, that if the prisoners escaped, the jailer was put to death, but for letting them go. So they were totally responsible for what happened to those prisoners. I suspect that the same thing happened here in Egypt, and yet this keeper of the prison, regardless of the consequences, he had so much trust in Joseph that he didn't even pay attention to what happened. He was basically out just goofing off and enjoying himself because he trusted that Joseph would do the right thing. That doesn't happen to people who are in bitterness and anger and unforgiveness and depressed and discouraged. This is quite a statement about Joseph. that here he was now in prison, and yet Joseph was still seeking God, trusting God, believing God. And it was so evident that people saw it, and this guy, at maybe the hazard of his own life, was willing to just turn everything he had over to Joseph. You know, you have to think and meditate a little bit to get these things out of these scriptures, but I can guarantee you that's true. You know, I've got 1,100 people that work for me. And I would say that, man, the vast majority of them, they're just awesome, awesome people. But we have a few people that when you get around them, they're just depressed, they're discouraged people. I don't promote people like that. I wouldn't put them in charge of things, people that have this bad attitude. And I can guarantee you, 4,000 years ago, it wasn't any different. For this jailer to put this kind of responsibility on Joseph, it is quite a testimony about the attitude that Joseph had. He had not given up. He had not run up a white flag and just thought, what's the use? Serving God doesn't get me anywhere. Man, he was still holding on to God. Even though every step he had taken, it looked like it was going in reverse instead of forward. So the keeper of the prison looked not to anything that was under his hand, because the Lord was with him, and that which he did, the Lord made it to prosper. And here, as we go into the 40th chapter, this is one of the greatest things about Joseph. I'm not sure I'll have time to get into this very far today, but I want you to look at what happened when Joseph was in prison. In chapter 40, verse 1, it says, "It came to pass after these things that the butler of the king of Egypt and his baker had offended their lord, the king of Egypt, and Pharaoh was wroth against 2 of his officers, against the chief of the butlers and against the chief of the bakers, and he put them in ward in the house of the captain of the guard into the prison, the place where Joseph was bound." Boy, this is divine. This is providence that God had these 2 people. In the place where Joseph was. You know, God doesn't just force us into doing His will, but there is providence that works behind the scenes. You know, if Joseph hadn't have been sold into slavery, and then if he hadn't have been put into prison, and if this baker and the butler hadn't have been put into prison, and if they hadn't have met, the connection never would have made, Joseph never would have become the ruler over Egypt. There's a lot of things that if they hadn't happened, these things couldn't have come to pass. And so I believe the same way, God is working in our behalf, even behind the scenes, sometimes when we don't even recognize it. I'm going to have to continue with this on our program tomorrow, but let me just mention that my staff put together a brief summary of this teaching on Joseph. This is the introduction to Lessons from Joseph, and we're giving this away as a free gift. And then I have CDs and DVDs that are taken from the television program on Joseph, and then we also have a like teaching on David and one on Elijah. Our announcer is going to give you a package deal, explain to you how you can get all of this material, and I encourage you to please take advantage of these.